and today I am discussing the 3 C's of user stories and SAFe, how they relate to each other. Some of you who have attended SAFe training, be it a leading SAFe or a POPM class, you might see a slide which talks about card, conversation, and confirmation, and give a reference of extreme programming and explain that this is how the user stories used to be worked upon. And you may a little bit struggle and says, okay, I got the idea. There is a card, conversation, and confirmation. But how this thing will work in a safe way of working? Because I have a ART backlog, I have a feature, I have a PI planning meeting, I have a sprint planning meeting or iteration planning meeting. How this whole thing, 3 C's of progressive elaboration, work in the safe way of working. So what I'm trying to explain here is, how can we see the incremental understanding of user story in a safe context? So let's start with 3 C's. So the fundamental idea of 3C, which was written many years ago, where there was no safe, where there was no visualization of doing things in such a big manner, it was basically focusing on that whenever you get a new idea, probably you make a note of it as a card. And when you think that this idea requires a little bit more understanding because we are planning about it, we want to talk about it, start having conversation about it at a later stage. Don't talk about the detail of it as soon as you get an idea. You may just make a reminder as a card, and later on you have more details about it. But when you are very clear that in a coming few days I want to implement it, then you should have some verification criteria or acceptance criteria written for a confirmation perspective of what is this requirement is all about. So you can say, I write a note, then I discuss about it, and then I add an acceptance criteria to it because tomorrow onwards or very soon my team wants to work on it and want to make sure that it start implementing as per my expectation. So that's the original idea. You can say card, conversation, and confirmation. Now, how we do it in a safe? So when do we write a summary level user story in a safe way of working? When do we create a card? So say you are in your innovation and planning iteration, or maybe before that also. During that time, your product owner, product management is already working on identifying what kind of features they would like to discuss in upcoming PI planning meeting. So in the SAFe, we work in a PIs, and our last iteration in a SAFe is innovation and planning iteration. And inside that, we do a PI planning meeting. So before PI planning meeting, my first level understanding of feature gets started. The team and product owners start collaborating it, and they may create one-liner, two-liner information about how they want to split the feature into small vertical slices. And that is where we create first level of user stories. So we can say the card kind of things we do before coming to a PI planning meeting. During PI planning meeting, or even before that, some stories may start getting discussion in detail as well. There is a possibility, but at least during a PI planning meeting, some more conversation may happen on those user stories, and we may start putting little bit more elaboration. So pre-PI planning discussions and during PI planning discussions gives me sufficient details about the user story, and we keep estimating them in the format of story points as well. So it is still at a card and conversation level. Many user stories may remain at a card level. Some user stories may also get at a detail of a conversation level during the planning for PI planning meeting and during the PI planning meeting. Why we need to do a conversation level details? Because you are expected to put a story point to it. You are expected to have some kind of sizing for a user story. Yes, it is not very well defined understanding, but you need to have some sufficient understanding so that you can put a story point to it. So you are done with your PI planning meeting, and all those user stories which you have created at a card or conversation level, you put them into a team backlog. So as we understand, the team members and the product owner will collaborate and they will prepare their team backlog, which will help them in implementing the PI objective in the upcoming PI. So we are starting there. Now we have to start a first sprint. So there is a probability that some of the user stories which are expected to get started in a first sprint, you may do maybe a day before or a half a day before a refinement of those user stories at further length. And that is where you are adding confirmations to it. Yeah, so card, conversation, confirmation. So those set of user stories which are expected to come in your first iteration, say 3, 5, 10, whatever, as per your team backlog, you start having conversation between product owner and the team members, and you refine and define acceptance criteria to it. So you add the confirmation only for near-term user stories, and remaining user stories remain in your team backlog. So for example, you may have a 20 user stories in your team backlog. Maybe you are working on, say, 4 user stories out of 20. Those 4 user stories, you have a well-refined acceptance criteria. So you are ready for upcoming iteration planning meeting. For remaining 16 stories, you may have a high-level understanding only, which is there in your team backlog. It does has an estimation, which is done in a PI planning meeting. Now you go in your iteration planning, you focus on these four user stories, you discuss about technical approaches, and for these 4 user stories, you may prepare an iteration backlog, but your team backlog contains the remaining 16 user story, which is still at a higher level. Then you start with your iteration, and during the mid of iteration, your product owner invite you as a team and start doing further team backlog refinement. Now, in this particular time, the 16 user stories which you have in your team backlog, which are not yet initiated, not yet get started, now you are looking at them, and you might be refining the upcoming 4 or 5 user stories at a level of acceptance criteria. You may start doing a little bit more elaborated conversation for remaining stories also, but we want to refine the user stories just in time, because during this first iteration, you learn about some technical details, you learn about some more dependency, and you as a team and the product owner wants to make sure that these new details are included when we are refining the upcoming user stories. So in a first iteration team backlog refinement, you may get the refinement level, confirmation level detailing for those user stories which are expected to come in the second iteration. And this is how you continue. In the second iteration, you may get ready for third. In a third, you may get for 4. And this is how you continue adding the user stories in your team backlog with the help of refinement. Now, somebody will say, while I'm doing refinement, what if my user story size get expanded? It may get expanded. We need to deal with it. We need to accept the new information as we get it, because for our rest of the planning, this new information is what is relevant. So in a safe way of working, or in any way of working, we need to keep revisiting our estimate, because the objective of estimation is to refine our planning and forecasting, and estimations are always error prone. So as we are incrementally elaborating and fine-graining our understanding of user stories, we are definitely adjusting their size estimations as well. So somebody will say, oh, but how do we do all these things if the size is increasing? That is something we need to plan about. We know in a safe principle, assume variability, preserve option. You can't assume the things will go as it is as you plan in a PI planning meeting. You start adjusting and adapting the idea, the PI objective, or the things you have planned in a PI planning meeting as you start executing the PI, and you definitely collaborate with relevant people in order to replan your work as you discover or learn something new about your work. So it's all about progressively elaborating the understanding, doing just-in-time refinement so that we can take latest information, having sufficient level of understanding so that we can forecast something in advance, but fine-graining details will come as a team backlog refinement is happening, and that is what we call it card, conversation, and confirmation. Now, related to it, you may also say there is something called invest also when we talk about user story. Yes, there is something called invest. Now, you probably can see as we are refining the user stories, the upcoming user stories for upcoming iteration are reaching to an invest level. They are the ones which are reaching at a small level and testable level. The stories which are expected to come in future iterations, second, third in our PI, they may remain at a non-invest level also. So we can't say that all user stories in a team backlog are at an invest level. You want to do just-in-time refinement to make sure that your user stories are invest. Now, what is invest? I'm sure you have seen them in your training classes, which is talking about independent, negotiable, valuable, estimated, and all those testable things. So those are the invest, which is a good acronym to talk about good user stories. But we need to understand the good user stories are the one which are expected to work upon soon. We don't want to create future good user stories, because if you are creating future good user story, they will become not so good by the time we reach to that particular stage, because we might not include the new feedback which we have received during this time. So we just call it just-in-time refinement, and card conversation and confirmation helps us in doing it. And this is how we can map this concept in safe way of working. Hopefully you like this particular idea, and you can share your comments, your observation about how you do the user story refinement in your safe way of working or your general way of working. You put into a comment area. And if you have any specific story to share, you can come in our podcast as well. Just drop us an email. We'll invite you and discuss your story or your case related to the refinement in the safe way of working or any area of your safe way of working. So if you are following this episode, you may want to subscribe to us so that you can get an update of our future episodes as well.